with some feedback from the first session with you guys. So please, we very much would love some additional feedback at the end of this and hear how this is. And I'm really excited to do this today. A quick note about me, I'm actually kind of operating out of way northern Minnesota today because I'm on a trip right now. And I did lose the call once.
Call recording is on.
If I do lose the call, I will dial right back in. It should take me no more than a minute. And I hope that the audio quality is good enough for everybody. And that all said, we're going to take off and start our session. All right, so what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about taking inventory of your information, including all the things that might be at risk of being compromised, and that'll help us kind of figure out what might be consequences of information being compromised. We're going to try to keep the focus very much, you'll notice that we have two parenthetical statements here, in the real world. I do a lot of work on security with organizations, and I always feel like I'm trying to start from a place of kind of de-escalating people's fears and saying, let's not worry about those super complicated, nefarious hacker operating out of the shadows of the internet, and let's worry about things that tend to actually happen and protecting ourselves from those things. So we're going to be looking at, what actually happens, how do things happen, and then based on those things, how you can protect yourself. And then we're going to talk about people in your company culture and how much of providing real security, even though this, it's hard to imagine a more complex and highly technical sounding topic as advanced cloud security. A lot of this really just comes down to people and policies. And hopefully that won't be a disappointment for people, but a lot of the things that you do to help your security really come down to just people and practices and not to incredibly complicated or expensive or fancy technologies. And so we're going to talk about that. Who am I? My name is Peskay. I work for a company called RoundTable Technology. We provide IT services to well over 100 organizations, almost exclusively nonprofit organizations, largely based in the New York City area, although we also have operations in Maine. And I've been working in some capacity providing services to nonprofit organizations for over 2 decades now in New York City. All right, we think we had the Idealware introduction last time, but for those of you who may not know, if anyone wasn't in last time or isn't familiar with Idealware provides webinars like the one you're participating in now. They do articles, they do research, and they provide an enormous amount of high-quality information to nonprofits to help them make really good technology decisions and smart technology decisions. I've been working with them for about 6 months now. They're a fantastic organization. I was an avid consumer of all their resources for many, many years before I began working with them, and I couldn't be happier to be working with them now and helping them provide this content. So when in organizations, who should be concerned, first of all, about security? And the sort of simple, easy answer is everyone, right? So one thing that I do hear a fair amount, and there's some little bit of validity to this, and I'll talk about what that is, but what I hear from some organizations is, well, we're not a big organization. We're just a small little 5-person foundation operating out of an Maine, let's say, and there's no one that's going after us, so we don't really need to worry about security. And there's just a hair of truth to that, but just a hair. The rest of it is they have to be just as concerned about security as everybody else. And I'll explain a couple of reasons why, and we're going to hit these points at multiple times during the presentation. By the way, Brian, if you could just tell me, is everybody seeing the chat window on top of my screen? I forgot that I'm the presenter. Or are you guys just seeing the PowerPoint slides?
We're only seeing the PowerPoint slides. The chat window doesn't come through.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you, Brian.
And just on a side note, under the phone button, there is an option to turn off that chime for when individuals enter the audio.
Gotcha. It is off.
Excellent.
Okay. Thank you so much, Brian.
No
okay.
problem.
Good tip. All right. So the kinds of things that are threats to organizations, we're going to hit this point first of all throughout the presentation today, but just talking about it now. Security is not just about, people breaking your passwords or stealing your information or changing your information or accessing it in some way. Security encompasses anything that touches your information or your access to your information. So disaster recovery and business continuity are actually part of security, because one of the pillars of security for people who were in the first presentation is availability or access to your information. And so it's not just about someone hacking in, but the little 5-person organization, if they don't have a good backup plan, then just a simple hard drive failure on a server that contains their data could be a security catastrophe for them if it wiped out all of their database records, all of their contact records, and all the information that they needed to run their organization. A lot of people wouldn't think of that as a security failure, but it does fall under this heading again because of availability. So you have to be able to protect your data not just from attack or from people accessing it, but also from the loss of that data in terms of you never being able to retrieve it again, and even the loss of availability of that data, meaning your ability to access it when you need it. All of those things are under security. And so when an organization's security is compromised, like it says here, a lot of times it's, and again, sticking with the real world stuff, it's not because someone hacked into them. It's because they just had an accident. Someone spilled some water on the server. They had a flood. They had an electrical storm and didn't have appropriate power protection in place, and something got fried. I've seen every single scenario that I just ran through that quickly in my 20 years, and most of them multiple times. So all of those things come into play when talking about security. I'm really going to have to pick up the pace because we got a lot of slides to get through. All right, so knowledge is power. So you want to first understand, all right, what information you have, where that information is, and this is a really important thing to think, what are the potential consequences of a security breach of that information, all right, or of the loss of that information, all right? So is it, our entire, if Chase Bank has their information compromised and someone gets access to all the accounts, I mean, the consequences to them are, almost impossible to calculate. It's, the money that they lose, the business that they lose, the reputation costs that they lose, all of those things. So they have to have a very, very high bar for their security levels and their checks and balances on all those things. So your profile is likely less than that, but especially in the legal services, there could be legal ramifications. You could lose your licensing. There are a variety of consequences that could happen depending on the information that's compromised and how it's compromised. All right, so what threats are possible, what threats, and what I would add to the possible are what threats are likely. What are things that you think are actually likely to happen and that make the most sense to start mitigating against? And then once you've identified where the information is, what its sensitivity is, and what threats are out there, then you start looking at, well, what mitigations can you take against those threats? And that's going to be the focus of the presentation today, kind of identifying this stuff. So start with, all the hardware and software and data that you have in your organization. Where is it? What is it? And a big piece here is thinking about how information moves in your organization. So if people are, have mobile devices that, have email on them, which is totally common in almost any organization these days, and sensitive information is being emailed to people, then anyone who has email on their mobile device has sensitive information on their mobile device, sensitive information that can be confidential information sitting on their own mobile device. So do you have a policy in place, for instance, that forces those devices to be password protected in some way, either a pattern lock or a password lock? Do you have policies that allow you to wipe those devices if they are out of possession of the owner, or if they, if the a worker who uses that mobile device is laid off or fired from the organization suddenly? Do you have policies maybe even that allow you to track the location of those devices? So if the device is suddenly in a location that you wouldn't expect it to be, you can send a notification to the user and ask them if in fact they are still in control of the device. All of these things are possible to do, are not terribly difficult to do, but it's really important to understand where your information is, especially in the mobile age. So where is that information stored? All right, so where is your hardware? Is it out in the open? Is it, are people, can anyone walk into your server room? Can anyone walk into the office? One thing that I find often overlooked in a lot of organizations is, just literal physical access to computers. So, people have pretty good passwords and things are fairly well locked down, but there's no timeout on desktop. So if someone just walks around the office, someone walks out for lunch, someone can just walk onto their computer and access anything that person has access to because there's no lockout in place on that computer. So again, and I'll repeat this over and over and over again, a lot of these things to make your office more secure are not super technical, are just pretty basic, and making sure that someone just can't walk into someone's office and start using their computer with all the access that that person has. For your remote employees, is there any kind of policy in place for how people access your data remotely? Can they access it from any computer when they're working from home? Usually this is the case. And if that's the case, then you want to make sure the staff have appropriate policies that guide their usage of that information about how they use it at home, so that it's protected from other people who may live with them. If they're working on a laptop, is that laptop stolen? What information is on that laptop? What is your ability to lock or wipe that laptop remotely, or even be aware that it's been stolen or out of service? Are things locked up when they're in your office in terms of your hardware, your servers? And for software, where is it stored? What kind of updates are being run? If it's on an employee's computer, how old is that software? Is it current version? Are all of the current security settings and security updates that are available for that software, have they been installed? The vendor still providing maintenance updates and support? Anyone who goes through a security audit will usually have checks run against these things for all the software you're using. So if you're using, for instance, Windows XP, and you would like to be HIPAA compliant or really compliant with any kind of regulatory body, then April 2014 is an important date for you to understand, because that's when Windows XP is going to go out of support with Microsoft, meaning they're no longer going to be releasing security updates for it, at which point it is officially kind of an insecure operating system, meaning you cannot be using XP for any HIPAA information within your organization and still be HIPAA compliant. So April 2014 is an important date. If you're using any other kinds of software that are older versions that are no longer being updated, you want to make sure that figure out what the latest version is that's still supported, that you can get all those security updates for. That way you can be sure you're in compliance with everything. And one of the reasons that this is important isn't just to give people like me and auditors jobs. It's because once vulnerabilities to these kinds of software are kind of publicly known, then continuing to have those vulnerabilities on your software leaves you even more exposed to risk than you were when the vulnerability existed, but only the vendor knew about it. So as soon as Microsoft, for instance, releases an update to, let's say, Windows 7 or to Microsoft Word or to any one of their products, once that update is released, now all of the nefarious people who write software to exploit these vulnerabilities, they get to see what the vulnerability was as well, and now can look to write software that exploits those vulnerabilities for people who are not up to date with all of their patches and updates. And so by being out of line with the updates that are publicly available, you're making yourself kind of one of the weakest targets for fairly lazy hackers and malicious software that's out there. All right. Who is responsible for your software? Are they able to keep it safe? So if it's software that's installed on your systems, make sure that you know that the people that are responsible for it. If you have a William Guyton in your organization, then you're in great shape because it's someone who stays on top of those things. And if you're not lucky enough to have someone like William in your organization, then make sure you have someone who at least understands what software they need to keep up to date, how to keep it up to date, can provide some accountability and reporting for that for all of your critical systems. If you're a cloud-based organization, which is primarily what we're talking about here, and the software is cloud-based, then generally they're going to be making sure it's up to date. But it's good to check on their policies and procedures and their current certifications like SAS 70s as well, and we talked about that in the last session. All right, this is part of business continuity and disaster recovery, but one of the first things that we do when we start providing ongoing support to an organization is collect all of the information about all of the vendors that are responsible for their critical systems. So phones, internet provider, software providers, if there's hardware facilities, if there's an alarm system, if there's all these other things, to make sure that that information, who's responsible for it, how you contact them, what the expected response time is. Are they a 24/7 company? Are they a 9-to-5 company? When are you going to be able to reach them? When are you not going to be able to reach them? That all of that is documented in some place and is available even if your office is not available. So if you can't get to your office or your office is offline, this information is intended for when those things aren't working. So make sure that that information is available in a place where you can get to it when those things aren't working. So that's something that's really important. William, if you're able to talk, William mentioned that he uses a KBox at case.com to handle software inventory and patching. And William, I just have a quick question for you as to whether that also handles patching for stuff like Adobe, Java, all those kinds of products. You can either answer in the chat or you can. It does all of those. Okay, yeah. Thank you so much, William.
It does. Yeah, there's 3 different versions or flavors of the KBox. There's a 1000, a 2000, and a 3000 series. As part of our standard deployment, when we deploy desktops in the firm, we put an agent on the as part of the image, and it reports back to the KBox internally. It gives us a hardware inventory, it gives us software inventory. It runs patching on a regular basis. It's got a help desk component that we use. So it's a nice automated appliance. We actually run it as a VM that allows automation for both the inventory and the updating process.
That sounds great, William. Thank you so much. So for those of you who don't have a handle on those things, that's one great tool that's out there. James put in another tool, ninite.com, that can also be used for patching non-Windows products, Adobe, Java, things of those nature. Those are really common exploit paths for malicious software.
Yeah, Northwest Justice Project uses Ninite, and it's great. We used it on an individual free level just for updating people's computers, and we now have a pro subscription where we can update a huge swath of computers at once for the 50, 60 different programs that it supports.
Great. Thank you, guys. Great stuff. All right, so should you hire help? So technology firms and independent consultants can help you with security in a variety of ways. Most organizations at our level don't require something as formal as what's called a penetration test, or a pen test for short. And that's where you actually have a security professional essentially try to get information. So you would put some test confidential information on your network, with some searchable terms, and then you would basically tell them, go see if you can get it without a login to our network, without access to our office, without anything like that. And then they will go and attempt to get that information and report back to you. I can tell you from experience working with some penetration test firms that almost always they get in through what's called social engineering, not through what most people think of as technical hacking. And so what they'll usually do is, just first try to walk into the office physically and see if they can just plug into the network or walk to a computer that's already logged in and start from there. And more often than not, they succeed at that because it's very easy. Another thing they'll do is call staff on the phone, call the reception and say, I'm so-and-so and I forgot my password. I'm wondering if you can, reset that for me or if you can send it to me. Or they'll ask for a list of names of people in the organization that they'll use to guess usernames and then start working their way in that way. So a number of kind of social engineering tricks that people will use that are, the first and easiest ways to kind of get into a network. So that's one of the areas where staff training and having people kind of be vigilant might be too strong of a word, but at least understand that, you would never, ever, ever give out a name of someone in your organization or certainly not a password over the phone to a person that you've never talked to before, really for any reason. The reason you would do that. That request should be forwarded straight to your IT administrator or your network administrator or, an executive within your organization before you would hand that out. But a lot of people, social engineering takes advantage of people's kind of instinct to be helpful to someone, and it's very effective for that reason. So something that is more appropriate for a lot of organizations at the level of the legal services and of the nonprofits that I work with is sort of helping people decide, and we're going to talk about this a little bit going forward, about what is kind of an appropriate level of security for your organization. Because as we're going to talk about later, the more security that you impose upon an environment, the more convenience that you take away from access to that environment. So the more you increase the security, the kind of less convenient things get. And so one of, I think, the biggest challenges is determining what's an appropriate level of security that gives you the security you need, but doesn't needlessly inconvenience your staff or make it more difficult for them to simply do their work. And that's, in my opinion, actually one of the more difficult challenges of security work. All right, so how do they happen in the real world? This is a new kind of picture that we have, which I think is a great way to sort of look at this from a kind of physical. So we've got an office, and then we've got visualized all the different threats. And we're going to take a little bit of time here to kind of walk our way through this. So starting from the upper left-hand corner, we've got just your good old-fashioned burglar, someone who's just going to come in from the outside and essentially steal equipment or steal files or steal things of that nature. Going down, we've got the kind of prototype nerd-looking person that represents our hacker. So that's, the someone outside who might be attempting to access your information electronically and get information out of your organization that way. Going into the office, going back up to the burglar and going, imagining going through that wall, you see someone leaning on the water cooler, and then right under the water cooler, you might see something that looks like a server. So a small little server in this office, someone just put it right next to the water cooler. So that's again, a lot of people don't think about that as a security issue, but if the water gets dumped on the server and all the data on the server is lost and isn't backed up appropriately or can't be made available to people quickly, then that becomes a security breach because that information isn't available. You'll notice on top of the filing cabinet, there's a wireless access point. You'll notice that, and it's kind of wide out in the open and anyone can get to it, which is not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but also not necessarily the best thing in the world. You've got the kind of ghost-looking thing, and that's going to be malware or viruses, or phishing attacks, all the kind of different malicious software that comes through. Inside, you've got the staff person with the mask on. So that's representing someone different from the burglar or the hacker. That's an actual staff person in your operation, but a staff person that's acting maliciously, who has intent to either destroy or steal information from your organization. That generally, both your well-intentioned staff and ill-intentioned staff are generally your biggest threats by a pretty wide margin. Are going to be your own staff in some form or another are the biggest threats to your security and your information. And then we've got the person out in the bed working from home on a tablet. So the question is, what kind of policies are there to help that person be secure? So these are kind of, all the different. I was working with Idealware to try to come up with a reasonable way to sort of visualize this for people, and so this is what we came up with. And I'm very interested in feedback on this and whether this is helpful to people in kinds of thinking about how these threats, where they are and how they are, and what you might add to this or remove from this. This is sort of our first crack at it. All right, so then after you've looked at the various threats and where they might come from, then it's to think about what are the consequences of not being secure. So what happens if someone does walk into our office and steal those files? What happens if someone does dump that water cooler on our server? What happens if a computer in our organization gets infected with malware and becomes unusable, or the information on that computer may be considered compromised? So think through what are all the consequences of these things happening, and the consequences can be in a number of different ways. Obviously, the first and most common consequence of someone's computer gets infected with malware is just the loss of productivity. The person's computer becomes unusable for a short time. You might need to change their passwords. You might need to change some other information and make sure it's all backed up. So maybe after an hour of time, loss of productivity for that person, and then your IT staff to respond to the request, identify that the software, the computer is compromised, and then re-image it and redeploy it. If you're a very efficient organization, let's say that's an entire hour that's lost, which is not horrible but not great. And then you can go up through information, confidential information being potentially compromised. You're having to notify someone that you had a breach and that their information, in fact, may have been compromised. You could actually have data loss where you lose information. If it's something like a server, even if you have good backups, if your file server is destroyed because someone dumps a water cooler on it or it suffers an electrical failure, it might be, depending on your backups and what your restore procedure looks like, a day or more before those files are available again to your staff. And if you have a really significant security breach, where people compromise your passwords, send out communications on behalf of people in your organization because they're able to use their email accounts for their own purposes. They're able to log into databases, essentially operate undetected as a member of your organization. Then the consequences are obviously potentially very far-reaching and potentially devastating to your organization. So you want to think through kind of all of those different possibilities for how that would happen and what protections you have against that. I'm going to pause just for a minute because I've been going for about a half an hour, about a third of the way through, and open up for questions. You can put them in via the chat, or you can unmute by hitting *6 on your landline and then unmute. And I'm just going to take a minute for questions, have a little glass of water.
I think one of the more interesting things that we've definitely been starting to deal with here is where these policies also intersect with bring your own device and laptops, things like that. We started to reach out to some of the local tech companies. Amazon, for example, any of their employees, they install basically an application on their cell phones that if a cell phone is lost, they can remotely deactivate it and remotely wipe it. With a lot of our case management systems and our email systems being accessible through people's cell phones, this is an interesting idea and it's something that I don't think has made it to the legal aid sector yet.
Yeah, if you're on hosted exchange, almost any platform, or on an exchange server, then installing the exchange component on your phone to enable you to access email actually does allow the administrator of that exchange server to remotely wipe your phone.
Mm-hmm.
One of the kind of, I think, complications for the BYOD, and you're starting to see some tools, and I'm interested to hear from William and anybody else on the call if they're actually using any of these, is that because people are, like you said, Brian, using their own personal devices, especially mobile phones, tablets, and laptops, to access corporate email and potentially other applications, what kind of tools are in place to help protect that? And the remote wipe is usually there, but the problem with the remote wipe is that if I'm a worker at one of the legal networks, then by just putting the legal network email on my phone, I'm essentially giving someone like William the ability to wipe my phone if they see a reason, and it would wipe all my personal information as well. So while most people just do that and don't think about it too much, some people who have thought about it and say, I'm not really comfortable with that, have created a market for sandboxing apps that you can put on your phone, where you can kind of create a separate space within your phone for your corporate email account, and then if that needs to get wiped, that gets wiped separately without affecting any of the personal area of your phone. And that has obviously a pro in that it protects your personal information from your corporate information. A bit of a con in that a lot of people want that information together. For instance, they want their calendars and their contacts kind of to be viewed in one place. So they have to search in two different places or check calendars in two different places. So there's pros and cons to that approach, but that's one option. But as William's pointing out, he's using the FortiClient as an endpoint. Having some ability to at least have visibility into all these endpoints as an administrator to see whether they're secure or not, and to at least have some reporting onto what's going on in them is really huge, if you can get that. And understanding what information is kind of out there on those devices that you may have to deal with if there is a compromise is also really, really helpful.
William, could you explain a little bit more about FortiClient? Because it's something I'm not familiar with. I've not tried it.
Sure. FortiClient is the endpoint that integrates tightly with the FortiGate next generation firewall. So we've got we backhaul all our internet for all the offices to one central point through a next generation firewall. And the FortiClient endpoint deploys on, well, we're testing it right now in multiple environments, but when it's fully deployed, what I anticipate will happen is if you connect to our case management system, which we self-host, and we've never seen you before, you're going to be redirected to a portal that requires you to download the endpoint software. And the FortiClient endpoint software enforces whatever security policy we have in place for the type of device that you're running, whether it be an iOS device or an Apple product or a Linux box or a Windows machine. It enforces, a simplistic rule set would be we're not going to allow you to attach to the case management system unless you're running antivirus software that's up to date, that your operating system is currently up to date. And you get granularity on the rules you want to enforce at firewall level through the endpoint. So the endpoint is your antivirus, anti-malware client. It also sets up the VPN tunnel, so it doesn't matter essentially where you're working from. And it's going to allow us, hopefully, to have a BYOD policy that allows just about anybody to connect, because we will already have predefined those security settings based on the device and what it is that you want to have access to.
Excellent. So that's really a way to take the bring your own device standards and implement them through the security settings of the software.
Right. So The firewall is going to enforce the policy, and you can have granularity based on who you are, what device you're connecting with, what you want to connect to, and where you're connecting from. So you get to see the full breadth of devices that are connecting, whether it's just to email or it's to the case management system or to a file share. And it allows you to adjust your policies based on, again, all of those factors. What are you running? Is it up to date? Do you have antivirus installed? Those kind of things.
And so, thank you, by the way, Williams. That's awesome. And I skipped ahead to a slide because I just wanted to point out this is a great example of that kind of convenience security trade-off, right? Because in order to get that kind of additional security for all those endpoints and visibility for the IT department, you get that by using that tool, but you're also adding a kind of additional obstacle for remote users to clear in order to be able to access their email or their case management software from that remote device, because they now have to go through an install process of this Fortinet software, and that's, you know, an inconvenience. Hopefully, you know, not probably a significant one, and one that I'm sure the IT department is very supportive of helping them through if they have any troubles. But generally speaking, everywhere that you add security, you're decreasing a little bit of convenience, and so you just always want to weigh those. And William, I want to be really clear, I'm not in any way discouraging that level of security. In fact, quite the opposite. I would always encourage it. I just want people to be aware of that trade-off that you're making and to take that into account in your implementation and decision-making process. All right. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to back it up. And I'm going to have to pick up the pace even more. Okay. So how do we improve security? So we add firewalls. You see a firewall sitting there on top of the filing cabinet next to the wireless access point now. That helps keep the hacker at bay. It's one of the things that helps keep the hacker at bay. You'll notice that the server has been moved from under the water cooler, is now in a locked private room within the organization. You'll notice that the person working at home, we now have some rules. So this is just what we were talking about, right? So William Guyton has implemented some rules, some software that has to be installed on a user's device at home that enables them to be confident that the device is secure and in compliance with the policies that the organization is setting. So that helps you out there. You have rules for at work. You have a written policy that describes what staff will do, what they won't do, how they are expected to use their computers. The staff will have read that and will have signed something acknowledging that they both read it and understand it. And that might be done both on their hire date and then annually if you're updating that policy with any kind of regularity, which you probably should be because this is a rapidly changing field, and then having your staff reread it and re-acknowledge that they have read it and understood it. You have virus protection on the computers, on the mobile devices. You know, it's pretty basic, something we've all hopefully been running for well over 10 years. And then, of course, you have just physical locks and alarms, maybe surveillance cameras on the building that help. So these are all things, pretty basic things for the most part, that you can add that can really help your security out. We're going to go pretty quickly through malware and viruses. I think everybody in this audience pretty well understands that. So I just want to point out that, and I say this for backups as well, there are generally two components to you know, anything that's security or backup related, or really anything that you want to effectively implement and monitor. And one is first having something, right? So having some, you know, antivirus software installed on a computer is better than not having any installed. And having some standard across the organization is better than having random antivirus software installed across, you know, all. But better and probably, you know, required, I would say, is having some visibility into the state of that software on all the different computers. So on the left, you have Microsoft's free product, which is Microsoft Security Essentials, which is a very good product, especially for a free product. Works very well. It's easy to install. It's free, which is nice. The downside to it is that if you're a large organization, with anything more than, let's say, 10 computers, it doesn't by itself provide you any ability to understand whether there's been a threat on a computer, whether the computers are all up to date. There's no kind of central management of that tool. You literally have to look at it on each computer in order to see whether it's up to date, whether it's running, unless you have some external tool like the case software that can give you reporting on that. Something like AVG Cloud Care, which is pictured on the right, gives you a central tool and also notification settings for the global, for all of the computers that have that software installed. So that can tell you whether the software is up to date and running properly on a computer, can alert you if it's not. And then if any computer does in fact encounter malicious software of any kind, it will notify you not only that it's encountered it, but what's happened. Did it clean it successfully? What software was it that it encountered? Is there any follow-up that's required? All of that kind of information. So it's hugely helpful to you from a security perspective, having that level of reporting. And the reason I use backups as an analogy for that is I would say that that's equally important with backup software, that you have to obviously have backup software in place, but if you don't have some kind of monitoring that's telling you that your backups are running successfully, that will alert you if the backup does not run successfully and tell you what files or what folders were failed to back up, then you're only partway there in terms of your solution. You haven't really implemented it. All right, password strength and security. So having a policy in place to help people have strong passwords. You can enforce strong passwords. I am a big fan of what are called passphrases and encourage people to use passphrases as opposed to passwords. So a lot of people try to use a password like X @ %, $339, something that's essentially impossible to remember or very difficult to remember, and actually, depending on how long it is, not terribly secure, because the number one component that adds complexity to a software is length. The longer, the better. And most systems will support spaces within passwords as well as normal punctuation. So I tend to encourage people to use fully punctuated phrases or sentences that are typically much easier to remember, will by nature of being a phrase or a sentence be longer, and therefore be significantly more secure than a single word or a single word with a couple of numbers and special characters tacked onto it. Having those things be there will help people, not put them on Post-it notes under their keyboards, and things like that. There are also, you can introduce password management tools. So two pictures here are LastPass and then something called Dashlane. There's another one called KeyPass. All of these for less. They're very inexpensive.
Josh, I think we might have lost you on audio there. Let me try typing this. Josh, still there? Josh just typed in that he is dialing back in now. His call got dropped. One thing that I want to mention on the password side is I've definitely seen some organizations that end up having individuals.
I'm back in.
Hey, welcome back, Josh. I was just making a quick comment on the password side. I've definitely seen some organizations that have had people change their password a little bit too often without some training around having passphrases, and it ends up creating a large headache for their IT department in having to recover passwords for people on a regular basis. So passphrases is definitely a great suggestion because they're easier to remember and more secure.
Yep. Thank you, Brian. And sorry, what was the last thing you heard from me, Brian, by the way, before you lost audio?
You had just mentioned the cost of the password management software, and then we lost you.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. So all I was saying is that in addition to that these don't cost very much, they can also help audit your saved passwords. So a lot of times if people are saving passwords in their browsers, or as you start to enter passwords into a password manager, they can tell you, A, where you're using weak passwords, and then B, where you're using the same password or something very close to the same password on multiple sites, which is a huge no-no from the security perspective. And so this has a benefit not only for you organizationally, but for all of your staff individually. And as people mix their personal devices and personal accounts with their business accounts more and more in the world, helping your staff having their personal information security be better is improving the security for your organization. So, helping them just be better password managers in general is really helping. So I really recommend these tools. For a person who's not super tech savvy, it is a little bit of a hurdle to clear to learn how to use it. But almost everybody I know, including non-tech savvy people, within a month or two of using one of these, it's kind of like, I can't believe I ever didn't use it. I don't know how I lived without it. And so it's a really great thing to have out there for yourself. So one I run into a lot, I'm guessing this isn't a big issue with this group, but I have a lot of organizations where they like to set passwords for their staff, not allow their staff to change their passwords, and then they keep a list of everybody's passwords so that, and their reasoning for this is that, well, if they're not there and we need to get into their account, then we need their password. And I've explained this probably 9,000 times because I run into it so many times. And I just repeat it over and over, which is that you don't need to know someone's password if you're an administrator in order to get into their account. In fact, you shouldn't. And I'm sure William will repeat this, he doesn't want to know someone's password either. If he needs to access an account, or if I need to access an account, I will reset the password to something I know and then access the account. And the person whose password I've reset has that protection for themselves, that they know that someone has reset their password. It is not possible for me to then go set the password back to what it was before because I never knew it and I can't know it. So they have the protection of knowing that I've changed their password, that someone has accessed their account, that their password has been changed, and yet I still have the ability to get into their information if that's needed for some critical business purpose. But there's really never a reason to share the password unless it's some kind of, movie-style crazy situation where you just need to get into the account super fast, don't have time for an administrator, you're on the phone with the person, etc. But passwords should be private, and if that's a practice in your organization, I would really encourage you to talk to your administrator and suggest that this is a better way to do things. Accidents happen, so we've talked about this. Security isn't just, for keeping out the hackers and, keeping out the malicious staff. It's also, and again, by such a wide margin, accidental deletion of data is the #1 security problem I see and the #1 cause for data loss that I see. It's just accidental deletion of data. Often it just gets moved accidentally. Someone does an accidental drag and drop and it gets lost. But making sure that you have good backups, you're confident in those backups are being monitored, and restore tests are being done regularly, and that someone is periodically auditing the selections for the backups so that you're not missing organization that might be critical to your organization. I'm going to start going kind of fast because we've gotten a little bit behind. It's totally my fault. but we have a lot to get through, so I apologize. So on the backup solutions, lots of options out there. One of the really great ones that's very low cost, that's kind of on the newer side, is called Crash Plan. I really recommend people take a look at that to see if it'll work for you before looking at other solutions. But there are all kinds of other solutions out there. But Crash Plan is one that I really like a lot. I've been using a lot. All right, so keeping everything in its place, keeping everything kind of locked up where it needs to be, keeping people from walking off with stuff is obviously, pretty important in terms of having organizational security. We've talked about that. Keeping your data where it is. So understanding and having policies for whether people can bring files home, whether they put things on USB ports, whether things are locked out from other networks. I've described this scenario a lot, which is that you can have all the security in place and everything to protect. But let's say someone, in your office, an executive prints out a confidential file, has a hard copy of it, takes it home, leaves it on a desk. Someone else that they live with, a teenage child, for instance, takes a photograph of it, puts it on Facebook. That information has successfully escaped all of the securities that you have put in place for your organization because of a person, again, without any technical savvy, without any technology being involved whatsoever, has managed to bypass all of your security protocols. So having rules that staff really understand about this stuff and are, with reasonable frequency notified of and made aware of is a huge, huge part of your security. Without that, everything else you put in place, as I described, is not going to be enough. Another thing is really sensitive information, credit cards, social security numbers, any kind of personal information on people. Figure out, do we actually have to have that information? Do we need that stored in our network? Can we store that only with third-party providers where that information is being used? Wherever possible, the best way to not have to worry about the security of the data is to not have the data. If you're not responsible for it, then you're not responsible for the security of it, and that's a huge help. So anything that you don't have to keep, don't keep. And that makes your, reduces your risk tremendously. Website security is often overlooked. I see a lot of organizations' websites get malicious software put on them, and then visitors to those sites can get malicious software, or if they're using good security software on their side, are just blocked from being able to access your website at all. So making sure that your website is up to date, and that both is the responsibility of the developer, the people who are responsible for the code on your site, and then also where your website is hosted. So whatever provider is hosting your website, you need to make sure that they have current security credentials and appropriate securities in place for your website. So keeping internal information safe, even internal data. So if it isn't important information and it's in hard copy form, make sure that it's locked up. A lot of organizations spend a lot of time worrying about their digital security, and then you walk into their office and everything is just totally in open cabinets, easily available for someone to just pull and get. Maybe they're not shredding documents, they're just dumping documents out, putting them in recycling. That is, especially for identity theft, especially if you have documents that have social security numbers on them, putting that stuff out without shredding it is a huge, huge exposure. So you need to make sure that you have policies in place for that sort of thing, and then shredding or appropriately taking care of hard copy information that's leaving your organization.
A quick question here. Most legal aid organizations are pretty strong about the shredding aspect. What do you see as the digital equivalents of shredding?
It's a great question, and especially when you get into cloud information. And with cloud information, there probably is not an equivalent to shredding. So if you're storing your information, any kind of confidential information in something like Dropbox, for instance, then I would be hard-pressed to say that there'd be anything that you could do after deleting it from Dropbox to be 100% sure that they don't have that information somewhere backed up in their network in a way that it could be retrieved. And that would be true for most cloud services, email within Google Apps, email within Office 365. So at that point, if it's information that you know at some point in the future you're going to want to erase it completely and not have a trail for digitally or otherwise, then you're back to encryption, in which we talked about a little bit last time, and using something like TrueCrypt to encrypt that information before it gets uploaded to any kind of cloud service. And that way, even if that information is able to be retrieved from the cloud service a long time in the future, it's still encrypted in that format. But I'm interested to hear other people's answers to that. William, if you want anything, or Brian, if you have thoughts about that.
I mean, that is definitely what.
Hello? Did I lose you?
Yeah, that's definitely what we have run into, even with Google services, when we have clicked something that said you were deleting all of an analytics account, which that was on our side a mistake. Noticed later, Google was able to recover all of those from a stored backup, even though we didn't have access to it. In most cases, cloud service merely remove the link to your copy of it, and if it's not written over at some point, or if it still exists in an archive, it's going to be there forever. So I think the encryption is the best answer.
Yep, and it's actually something that I'm sympathetic to the cloud groups. I don't want to take too much time here, but if you think about the number of stuff that they're backing up and how they're handling that, it's actually difficult for them to go into a backup, of many thousands of terabytes of data and pull out a very specific thing and make sure that it's not recoverable in the future. And so they're trying, to default to have information available to people, which makes the most sense. But that's inherently at odds with having that information not be retrievable in the future, and so that's a real issue.
Yeah.
All right, so content filtering, this is not as much of a security issue, although it will protect you from some things, but certainly, and everybody in the legal services understands this is an important element to reducing your exposure to things like harassment complaints within the office, having unsafe or inappropriate sites blocked as a policy can certainly help. I also want to mention the service, which is a free service, OpenDNS.com, which is a free DNS service. Gets a little bit technical for those of you in the audience that are not technical, but they provide a free service that adds a layer of security and also generally improves the performance just a little bit of your internet browsing. And very quickly, the way it works is that one method that people will use to sort of tackle what are called phishing attacks. So they'll send you an email that'll look like it's from Chase Bank, but when you click on it, it's not actually taking you to Chase. It's taking you to somewhere else that's made to look just like Chase in an attempt to get your username and password for your Chase Bank account. OpenDNS will stop that sort of thing because they recognize all of those sites and can keep you from even browsing to them in the first place. So it's a really nice service to have, totally free, totally easy to use with anything else. So the only way to truly protect yourself, I think in the last one we had the bunker in the mountain, totally disconnected. So here is cutting yourself off from the internet. I think as we've talked about, even that probably wouldn't totally protect you, but obviously it's not practical. I've talked a lot about the trade-off in terms of convenience versus security. And that, this, again, is one of the biggest challenges that I have, is helping organizations achieve what I think is the right balance. Most organizations are currently, the recliner is on the floor and the safe is up in the air, meaning they're very insecure and very convenient. So usually we're imposing some additional inconveniences to them to try to get them to a security place where we're comfortable. Sounds like most of the people in this audience are better off than that, and that's certainly a great thing. So you can require multi-factor passwords for everybody in the organization, but if people have to put in a password and then put in a security key that's coming off their phone or off a little key fob, and then put in a biometric, I mean, obviously that's a lot of stuff to support from the IT side, and a lot of stuff for the staff to deal with from their side. But there are some instances where that's appropriate. I used to have a bunch of servers in a colo out in New Jersey. They had three-factor authentication in order to get in. So in order to get physically into that facility, because I was walking into a server room that contained physical servers from thousands of different companies, in order to get access to that room, you needed a username and a password that you would type into a keypad. You needed a physical key card that they gave you that was carried with you, and then you needed to put in your thumbprint. And only those three things got you into that room. So it was, if I drove all the way to New Jersey and I forgot my key card, that was a big pain, but it was a very secure room. Who supports multi-factor authentication right now? Right now it's just Gmail and Dropbox, and I'm certainly not shilling for Google or anything, but I absolutely applaud them. They've had this two-factor authentication for going on 3 years now. Still, no one else has it. Dropbox just added it finally. Microsoft shows no signs of adding it, although they talked about it. As William pointed out last time, there's another service you can use called Phone Factor that allows you to add your own two-factor authentication to a system that itself doesn't support it. So that's a good thing to be aware of. You could get, biometric locks for every single door in your building, but, can you afford that? Do you want to support your staff going through that? You could block remote access. So if William decided he was tired of trying to manage security and all these endpoints, he could just say, okay, no one's working remotely anymore, but is that going to fly in the organization? Is that practical? Is that going to make sense? Is the productivity loss from that restriction? Probably not. You need to be able to support the remote access. Most organizations need it. So the question is, how can we provide it in a way that's still sufficiently secure? So this gets back to kind of where we started, right? Which is figuring out what's the most important information. What information would have the most impact if it was compromised? Would you or your clients lose money? Would you lose reputation? Would you be sued? Would you be, delicensed? There are a variety of things that could cause you, that could be the consequences of that. So go back and think through all those things. Where does your data live? Who has access to it? Can it be put on other devices, stored in other places, left other places? One of the other things, Brian, that you talked about in terms of the BYOD is what's called shadow IT, which is a term that's used to describe staff just setting up their own places to store information because it's more convenient to them. So staff who don't really like all the restrictions of the corporate environment where their shared files might just set up their own Dropbox account, and 3 of your staff might be using their own Dropbox system to share corporate files, and they've never talked to IT. IT has no reasonable way to know that that exists and no means to manage the security of it, obviously. And so I find that from a strategic standpoint, you have to just communicate with your staff a lot and make sure that you're giving them all of the functionality that they need while also having the security that you need. And if you, again, impose restrictions that, raise the convenience, raise the access bar too high, then you actually may wind up hurting your security in the process because you'll create these shadow IT operations. And I've seen that in a number of different places. So it's almost a kind of can't-win situation for the IT people, but the way you win is by keeping those communication lines open and providing that really high level of service. And that helps the staff continue to work within the infrastructure that you're providing them, which then you have control over from a security perspective. Talked about this. The easiest way is to not lose data and not have it compromised is to not have it in the first place. So can you outsource that? All right, we're going to spend a little bit of time here because this is another place I want to talk about. I do kind of business continuity and disaster planning or disaster recovery planning for organizations pretty consistently. And I've found that kind of asking yourself some very basic questions and some basic scenarios and not worrying about every possible bad thing that can happen, but just focusing on these things will really help you understand what is important to your organization and how you can function. So the first thing that I ask people to sort of envision is just taking away electricity from your office or your offices for 10 days or more, and thinking through what information would we not be able to access, what kind of functionality would we have. In that scenario, what work would we still want to be able to do? What information would we still want to be able to access? And then could we do that work? Could we access that information? The next thing is to identify a couple of key staff and remove them from the picture and figure out, if we lost someone like William from our organization unexpectedly, if he just, up and left one day and didn't leave us anything, do we have the documentation that someone else could come into the environment and with reasonable expectations be able to continue to support it, or did all of that institutional knowledge leave with that person? It essentially gets down to a kind of documentation and communications question, which is that, do you have any redundancy within the organization and the ability to recover from a particular staff person? And then the last one is just take your office completely off the map. So just imagine walking into your building and all the servers and all the computers and all the desks and all the paper and everything that was in there. It's just a paved over parking lot. Everybody's fine. And, you could even give yourself, the most miraculous insurance company in the world and say that the very next day, 24 hours later, they give you a brand new building with, all working computers, and there's just none of your information or applications or anything there. So how you would recover from that scenario, again, asking all those questions, will go a long way. So from, again, repeating that business continuity and disaster recovery are part of security, having plans in place and an understanding of how you would deal with each of these scenarios and what you would and wouldn't be able to do and what information you would and would not be able to recover is really, really important. And it doesn't have to be, super complicated. Just give yourself these couple of scenarios, and that'll be a huge help. So, is everything secure? Do you have a good network password? Is the server someplace that could be stolen? This gives you just a quick walkthrough of all the things you can kind of ask yourself about your office. What's easy to protect against? So we talked about passwords. We talked about antivirus. We talked about getting computers in a secure location. A firewall is not a terribly expensive device for most smaller organizations. You're talking about something $400, between, let's say, $400 and $1,000, and that will cover both the firewall and the service called Universal Threat Management, which is a service that gets its own security updates from a centralized server, usually many times a day. So it's getting updated much more frequently than, let's say, the antivirus software on a computer, which is typically updated only once a day. And that firewall is monitoring all the traffic that both comes into your network and goes out of your network. So that adds a huge security piece to your network to help protect you from those things. Again, it's not a very expensive thing, not a terribly difficult thing to configure. Just to give you an example, with most organizations, it's a pretty basic thing that we put in. So the cost of the device that we recommend for most organizations is about $400. The renewal for the subscriptions for it is about $100 a year. And then our cost to install it and configure it is typically about 2 hours. So for a total cost of under $1,000, well under $1,000, the organization has a really good, high-functioning firewall with good security running on their network and monitored. So that's a really good option to add. Policy changes. So what can be fixed with policy changes? Making sure that staff aren't sharing passwords with each other, that they aren't sending inappropriate or confidential information over emails, that they aren't letting unknown people in the office, that they aren't giving out confidential information over the phone, that they aren't opening attachments to emails that they weren't absolutely expecting from someone, even if it's from someone they know, that they maybe have some basic training in understanding phishing attacks, so they kind of know some of the keys to look for in a phishing email or in a faked website. These are things that don't take a lot of time. You could do one little lunch training a year and give your staff a lot of really important information. That would be a good protection there. What is enough for you? Okay, so is the worst case scenario that our entire business is gone? If Chase Bank, suffers an extraordinary hack, and their reputation is completely shot. It probably wouldn't wipe out Chase Bank, but it would certainly cost them potentially billions of dollars. Smaller organizations, especially if they're online organizations, could in fact be almost destroyed by a fairly basic security breach. Or if your organization is the worst case scenario of what would happen, just an inconvenience or a setback. And that will kind of help you determine how much effort you need to put into the security. So as I've described multiple times, the technology can only do so much. It's still up to you to know what you have and have the right practices and policies. The cloud, as we talked about, isn't always safe, so you still need to think about your security even if everything's in the cloud. You still have to pay attention to these practices and policies. It does not have to be expensive. So a lot of nonprofits are on limited budgets. All of these policies and practices that we've talked about don't cost anything other than time. Time does cost something, but these are not hugely expensive things, and these are not hugely technical things. So to make some really significant security improvements for your organization, you can do them without hiring outside people, without purchasing additional equipment, without purchasing additional services, just by implementing some basic policies and practices and putting yourself through this process of asking yourself these questions, determining what your risk is within your organization, where you need to kind of change some practices or policies. All that stuff, not difficult to do, not expensive to do, and not even terribly time-consuming to do. You just have to go through the process. Consult with your staff. So find out sort of where the biggest pain points are. Again, I talked about the issue of this kind of shadow IT. Sorry about that, I just had to cough, so I muted myself for a second. One of the things I've seen is this shadow IT that crops up. So if you don't have enough services in place for your staff, but they feel that they can access their information when and where they need to and how they need to, or if you impose security restrictions on them that make it so difficult for them and you don't provide sufficient support for those security restrictions, then you may in fact create a shadow IT environment that circumvents all of your security that you've put in place. So talking to your staff, finding out what they need, how it's working for them, what security questions they have, what concerns they have, that's a huge part of this process, and making sure that you can do it. Every probably year is about right, but if you want to do things more frequently, you can go quarterly or every 6 months. But do an audit of your security. Determine what things have changed, what risks have changed, and what things you might need to implement or what policies you might need to revise in order to address those changes that have happened. Have recurring trainings. I talked about this. One thing I've seen that's really helpful is just, if this is within your budget, providing a lunch for your staff. And having a lunch where you give them maybe 20 minutes of content on a basic security thing. And again, I've found this to be really true with a lot of organizations where we've done this. The staff really appreciate getting this help because they have these concerns about their personal information because they're often may have actually had an identity theft scare or had their personal email account hacked and someone emailed all their friends asking them to wire money to Europe in the middle of the night, or they've had security concerns about their home services and their personal services. And so because a lot of these security trainings will help them with their personal information, they're very, very responsive to it, grateful to have it, and again, by improving their personal security, you also improve your organizational security. So that's a really nice kind of win-win, so to speak, in terms of providing some help for your staff and some help for your organization. Obviously, new employees, make sure there's a very documented and defined onboarding process that incorporates training in terms of how to use the systems and an understanding of what the security policies are and how information can be accessed, and make sure that new staff are only given access to information that is appropriate to them, and that there's some kind of audit of the access controls, meaning of who has permission to what information. Exiting a huge weakness in many, many organizations I see, that when staff leave, there is absolutely no appropriate kind of cleanup of their accounts and of the things that are there. So one thing that's really important from a security perspective is to make sure that you only have accounts on your system that are active, that are being used by active staff. And then one of the first things that an auditor will do, if you ever go through a security audit, is they'll come in and ask for a current staff, and they'll sit there and look through the list of active accounts on your system and see any names that aren't on your current staff directory, and then ask you about all of them. Who are these people? Why are they not listed here? Where are they listed? Why are they active users on your system? So you want to have a way to make sure that all of the active users on your systems are, in fact, active users on your systems, and that when people are consultants or interns or staff and their work with you stops, then their account is appropriately disabled and, if appropriate, removed from the system so that it's not there anymore. Usually, simply disabling an account is sufficient, and that way if the person comes back or if there's information that you want to review from that account, it's still there for you. You don't have to delete it, but you do need to disable it. Know your legal requirements. We provided, or I should say, Brian and William and other people in the session have provided excellent links to resources to help you understand the compliance rules, but obviously understand what your legal requirements are based on what kind of work you're doing and what kind of information you're managing. And if you think this is beyond you, then please, by all means, get some outside help. And just, the more you understand in terms of how to frame what help you need, the better off you'll be in making sure you're not getting exploited by an outside provider or getting charged for services that you really don't need. And we rushed a little bit through the last 20 slides there, but we managed to finish with 5 minutes. So we're going to open up for some questions. And thank you all for your time. And sorry I had to rush to the end there. I was a little too slow in the beginning part. But feel free to *6 to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. Otherwise, you can enter a question into the chat. And I thank you all so much for the session today. And I'll hang out for a few minutes and see if anyone has any questions. Brian or William, do either of you have anything you want to add to that 20-minute flurry I just went through at the end of this?
First thing, I just want to mention that the link to the SurveyMonkey survey is up in the chat. If you've got a second, please click on that and give us feedback. This is the first time we've done this two webinar series on security, and would love to have feedback on it. Second thing, I think that you really hit on some great points when it talks about process. Something that we'll look at doing for LSNTAP in the future is getting a hold of one of those security audit sheets and customizing it for legal aid organizations so that they can use that as a walkthrough of their own organization. You definitely need those procedures and training at the beginning of an employee's life cycle, then some checkup to see how they actually do their work. Every time we end up meeting with a committee here at Northwest Justice Project, we do end up finding different tools that people use, and they may not even realize that they're living in that shadow realm that you're talking about, where they've created this offsite or separate way of dealing with information. And then it's our job to reach out to them and help bring them into the fold of keeping information secure and accessible, and then also having those cleanup procedures that are done when employees move on to another organization is just essential.